everybody. My name is Kunle Olulode. I'm the director of charity Voice for Change. Really pleased to be here to look at this subject. Music is a passion of mine. I've both been a DJ and a producer of live shows for artists such as the Beatnuts, the Roots, and a whole host of other music genres. The subject at hand today is the question of drill music, and in particular, the question of its relationship to violence on London streets. To lead us into that discussion, we have three retrobates of the urban scene who are going to touch on the various aspects of this. And I think, really, we're talking about a discussion that, whilst it may have absolutes, there are relative differences, I think, in the opinions of our speakers in relation to the question that's at hand. So just to go through them, on my right, I have Fraser Myers, who's a writer and a producer of this actual session. He writes with Spiked and also produces its podcast. To my immediate left, we have Dr. Patrick Turner, who's a senior lecturer in sociology at Bath Spa University, and he's also the author of the book Hip Hop versus Rap, the politics of dropping knowledge. And then, who's the first speaker up, who's going to lead us into this discussion, is Ciaran Thapar, a freelance youth worker and writer on British multiculturalism and the underground music scene. And is particularly interested in the evolution of UK rap and drill music, which he's written on for The Guardian, The New Statesman, Prospect, Cracked, etc. So time is short, so I'm going to introduce the first speaker, Ciaran Thapar.
Thank you. So just to give a kind of 2-minute quick run through of what drill music is, because I realise if we're going to be talking about it the whole time and there's anyone in here that isn't quite sure what it is, it's probably not going to be that useful. Drill music was founded in the south side of Chicago. It is a type of hip-hop, a type of trap music. It feeds off the kind of disenfranchisement of predominantly young men and also the shareability of it on social media. And then it kind of cross-pollinated across the internet to the UK a few years ago, where it has really taken off and become very popular amongst young people, especially in London. And it's especially made in pockets of the capital city, where there is lots of poverty. Attached to the music genre is now a moral debate about its position in society, whether it's kind of causing or reflecting the violence that's being seen on the streets of London right now and to an extent the rest of the country. And so I guess that's why we're brought today, and I'm guessing that if you're sat here, you kind of knew parts of that, but that was just to clarify that. So I kind of have two different hats in my career. I've got my journalist hat and I've got my youth worker hat. So just to start with my journalist hat, if I told you that over the last year and a half, I've spoken to countless young people in group and one-to-one discussions who listen to and make drill music. But in particular, I've interviewed some of the biggest names in the genre. So for people that know the genre, and even if not, Carnes Hill, I spoke to, is the 6-7's producer, one of the biggest, arguably the creator of the genre. We spoke about how he's used music as a platform for his community to raise the voices of young people on his estate and allow them to have a source of social mobility to escape the trappings of their lives. I've interviewed AM and Skengdo, and we talked almost exclusively about how desperate they are to leave their estate and leave the life that they were living behind. AM's actually subsequently bought land in Uganda, where his mum's from, off the money he's made from music. Kenny Allstar, who is the gatekeeper of the drill scene, he presents Mad About Bars, which is pretty much the main freestyle platform on YouTube, where lots of drill artists go and drop freestyles. He says that in every single freestyle, he noticed that when a drill artist enters the booth, they come in usually quite aggressive and angry, and when they leave, they are usually quite calm and ready to talk. So it's often a process of catharsis, he sees that as. And last week I interviewed LD, who's the kind of masked symbol of drill music, you could say, who's the lead MC of Group 6-7, who talked at length about how drill music's allowed him to gain a language of business and branding and kind of slow down, make much better decisions about his life. The reason I use these examples is because I think that in amongst them there are these two stories that I've tried to explain in my journalism, and I try to kind of bring to light alongside the more critical lens that society has generally taken about the genre, which is that music is both a form of social mobility for a lot of the people making drill, and is also a form of therapy and expression. And those are valuable, positive stories that are largely missed unless you go digging for them. And I think that, in general, we have a media establishment that isn't willing to go digging for those stories. To give an example about one of the problems I've had as a writer, and I guess as a youth worker, but for my journalism, to stay on my journalism for a second, when I appeared on the 10 o'clock news on BBC One earlier this year, when the panic around drill music kind of surfaced, and the BBC producer rang me up beforehand and said, we're going to come and video you. Can you just walk to your nearest council estate, and that's where we'll do the shoot. He didn't know where I lived. He didn't know anything about me, apart from the fact that I'd written about drill music. And I ended up having a 45-minute argument with him, which for me epitomized a lot of the problem about this response, because the response to this genre, because it said that this person was willing to just kind of throw me in front of a council estate and have me represent the hundreds of people that live there, and also therefore attach all the kind of problems associated with drill music in his head to this very potentially sensitive space where lots of people live that they have nothing to do with what I'm talking about necessarily. And he didn't even know where I lived either. So for me, that was like a valuable anecdote that really like drove me to try and be quite nuanced when I was talking about this, especially when representing the genre in the media. I think even the fact that we're having this topic right now on this day means that there is this kind of like drowning out potentially of a conversation that we could be having about other core issues that I believe are more fundamental to the issue of violence, the misuse of social media and the kind of miseducation whilst using social media that a lot of young people are unable to use social media properly, and I don't think we're educating them how to do that. The obsession with making money and consumerism that I think young people are increasingly adhering to by virtue of the society we are living in, where adverts are kind of thrown in our face. The idea of making quick money is becoming like an absolute norm, and you need to do that. You need to go to university and get into debt. You don't have as many youth services in areas that maybe need them. There's reduction in mental health support for teenagers, increase in school exclusions. You're still more likely to be stopped and searched if you're a young black boy than if you're a white person. I think there are lots of different forces going on, cuts to policing. There are lots of different forces going on that we could be talking about with regards to violence that I think is more useful than necessarily focusing too much on drill. That's my journalism hat. My youth worker hat, a lot of the young people I work with and use and talk to and try to gain trust with, I can talk about drill music and within 30 seconds, they will trust me absolutely. And for me, that says a lot about the power that this music has and what it represents. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't a problem with the content of the music. Obviously, there is, and it's a problem that there are young people who are going around speaking about stabbing one another, who are indulging in misogyny, who are talking about drug dealing. But for me, the truth, the power of the music, and the way that it represents a lot of young people's realities that aren't necessarily listened to otherwise, I think that that's represented in the response I get from a lot of young people I work with, which is essentially that I'm able to open a dialogue with them about issues that concern them, they don't feel comfortable talking to other adults about. And music gives them that dialogue to be able to do that and opens that up. So I think for me, as a youth worker, we live in a society that's kind of squeezing the most vulnerable communities, and for me, drill has just arisen out of that as a way for young people to tell their stories who otherwise aren't able to tell their stories. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next up, Dr. Patrick Turner.
Okay, hi. So what I'm going to do is just offer a few provocations for reflection on UK drill and something around its troubled reception. So I'm going to speak briefly, but not in great detail, about the question of moral panic and then lead into a little discussion about moral agency within the drillers themselves. And then that's going to lead me to consider whether, as some people claim, particularly people of my acquaintance who do the kind of work that Ciaran does in youth work, and also people from the UK hip-hop community, whether drill can be rehabilitated in some way, whether the kind of seeds are there or the possibilities for something different, and obviously, by implication, better. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to say is, if we think about the idea of evil, okay, and the problem with the idea of evil, well, we can say that what it does is potentially relieve us of responsibility to think about and deal with complexity, with moral complexity. And that's why it's so useful to demagogues and hypocrites. Now, in terms of the response to drill music from the tabloid media, politicians and police, there's been this attempt to mobilize fear around the baleful presence of some kind of absolute evil as evidenced in the depictions, in the videos, or the enacting, or that kind of acting out of the stabbing and slashing and shooting, and all of the references to the rivalries, the beefs, and the actual acts allegedly committed or to be committed. Now, the counter responses to that have emphasized that this is all very confected, it's whipped up, it's a moral panic. We've been around this, time and time again, and most recently in relation to British hip-hop culture, or a part of or something that is related to British hip-hop culture. People argue it. People were saying this about grime at least 10 years or so back. The same kinds of claims were being made about it. And all we're seeing here is a powerful establishment with privileged access to media, politics, law, and policing, who are demonizing people who are located at the social margins. And what's more, that much of this discourse is racialized and classed in its nature. Now, okay, that's all well and good, but how then do we address this question of whether drillers themselves have or ought to have moral agency? To be made accountable for the things that they say and represent or try to symbolize in some way through their music and their videos. Now, we know, that social explanation is complex, or ought to be, in terms of multi-causality, whereas moral condemnation tends to be straightforward and easily comprehensible. Moral condemnation tends to flatter people's understanding and is emotionally satisfying. Okay. But it still doesn't take us away from this problem of responsibility. So we have to operate with the knowledge that a moralizing response is clearly insufficient, and to try and mobilize the figure of evil is clearly deeply problematic. But we can't get away, I would argue, from the question of responsibility, because these videos, these rap lyrics, are quite different in their nature in many ways to what we've seen over the kind of course of hip-hop history, in terms of a move away from a narrativizing or storying of particular acts, or a critical commentary in conjunction with an exalting of one's hustle or whatever it is, to something whereby the key determinant of authenticity is one's direct experience, okay, and one's authority to be a drill rapper in that sense derives less from one's artistic and aesthetic ability and is authorized with an appeal to what one has done, what one is capable of doing, and what one might do. And I think we ought to take that seriously in some way. But again, like I say, not in a moralizing or simplistic or indeed emotionally satisfying way, but in a way that genuinely challenges us. Now, if we think about the way that people have talked in recent years about a discourse of responsibilization, this was a criticism that was made very much during the New Labour era about efforts to moralize or sort of infuse with a kind of moral spirit the working classes and the socially excluded to encourage them to take responsibility for their lives, okay? With all sorts of kind of overtones of, culture of poverty and so on. And people pushed back against that and said, no, this is a responsibilizing discourse, yeah, that completely leaves out of consideration the structural conditions and proper socioeconomic determinants of their situation. But again, the problem with that is with that as a pushback is that it kind of leaves everything at a sort of level of ideas, yeah? So that everything in that sense is a social construct, and that instead of actually engaging, again in a difficult, messy and complex way, with the behaviors, with the issues themselves, we're engaging with the discourses about the issues, the ways in which people are talking about those things. And we're calling out the privilege, the relative privilege of the people who construct those discourses. Now, I'm not going to argue for 1 minute that that isn't valid in some way. It's valid, but it's insufficient. I think that we can appreciate everything that Ciaran's saying, that what these young people are doing is offering some sort of transcript of their experience, that it comes from a very real place for them existentially. And we can absolutely reject calls for censorship and state suppression. But we don't need to evade the question of the acts themselves, the meaning of the coded words, and the realities that they refer to. So that now brings me on to then some of the responses from people within the hip-hop community who are trying to take this on. Yeah? Now, I'm not going to refer to particular projects, although I have a few in mind. I'm just going to kind of offer a sort of generalized sense of what their concerns are. But there is this idea that drill can be rehabilitated. For example, when grime came out, as I said, much of what's said about drill was said about grime. And at that time, there were educational projects and there was community work that was working with young people who were producing and performing grime lyrics and making grime videos and so on, who were they were attempting to challenge the lyricism, to develop the quality of the thought, and to encourage the producers and makers of this stuff to become more critically reflective about their own work and their own ideas and their own grasp of their own realities. And I observed quite a lot of that work through my research. Now, a couple of points that I think are important to sort of emphasize here. The first one is context is all important, and that's to say the institutional context of the intervention. When I was observing that work, there was a very problematic conjunction between, on the one hand, this rehabilitating mission from within the hip-hop community, and on the other hand, the concerns of the state at that time, the forms of behavior modification that they were invested in terms of how they thought they could deal with social exclusion and things like that. And there was a kind of coincidence of interest there, so that the work of hip-hoppers was being funded to do this, to do this kind of rehabilitation stuff with young grime spitters or rappers. What I thought was problematic about that was that there was no account of those power dynamics, of those institutional dynamics, and of that wider political and policy context in the understandings of the educators. So there was much talk about oppression, and there was much talk about the things that would directly impact on the young people and why they might think the way that they think and what the real source of their problems were. But there wasn't much thought given to the fact that all of this was taking place within contexts of high levels of surveillance. Okay? These were highly surveyed contexts in which youth work had lost its informal basis and was being given over to behavior modification and all types of formal assessment and monitoring of young people and information sharing and things like that. And I was very struck by the general lack of awareness on the part of the educators to those power dynamics. Now, when I say this, I'm not kind of arguing a sort of absolute libertarian or sort of anarchist line that, this shouldn't happen or nothing should happen of this nature within the parameters of kind of state intervention. No, I'm not arguing that. But what I am trying to urge here is that if we are going to talk about politics, if we think that forms of rehabilitation of the sort that I've referred to have a kind of political basis as well as a moral basis, then it surely behooves anyone who's doing that work to educate themselves about the moment, about the present moment in which they're doing that work. And my last point would be this. I think one of the challenges will be, in terms of trying to rehabilitate drill, will be around this question of authenticity, okay? If it is the case that what gives drill the kind of power and attraction, because it is powerful and it is attractive and it has a large audience amongst young people, that it trades on the idea of direct experience and authenticity, and that sort of supersedes or transcends lyrical or artistic ability, then to utilize the kind of long-standing hip-hop ethos that your ability in the battle or your ability as an artist to rap and to flow and to produce strong lyrics is actually more important than your identity at the end of the day, then there's an interesting tension there. And it's an open question. I wonder how that is going to be resolved. So I'll end there.
Thank you. And last up, Fraser Myers.
So I am going to start by talking about how we talk about it, just to give an idea of the context. So I've got a couple of quotes that I'm going to read out to you. This kind of music is deplorable. It fosters almost totally negative and destructive reactions in young people. Another one, the music I heard says that life was cheap and that murder was okay. This music promotes the attitudes and actions of killers. If this message of hate and violence is promoted in our community, we're afraid that we will see more people bleed, both physically and emotionally. And finally, after listening to 12 hours of this music, I wanted to knife someone. I wouldn't, of course, because it's not in my nature. Now, some of you might have noticed that absolutely none of those were about drill music. Two of them, the first one, was by Frank Sinatra, moaning about Elvis Presley. One of them was from a founder of a support group called Parents of Punkers, and their aim was to de-punk suburban teenagers and young adults. One was about Marilyn Manson, who in 1999 was blamed for the Columbine high school shootings. And the final one, about wanting to knife someone, was actually about grime, which we sort of alluded to earlier. It was from The Sun in 2008. And it is interesting that grime has, of course, gone from being an object of fear, revulsion, and derision when it first appeared, and now today is largely celebrated by the cultural establishment. So, obviously Skepta was given the Mercury Prize 2 years ago. Last year, the Conservative Culture Secretary said he was worried that the police were discriminating against grime artists, and he said that grime had created a new generation of musical heroes. Stormzy, in particular, is held up by many in the media as someone who holds the correct Islington dinner party values of hating the Daily Mail and being open about his mental health. And I draw on those old examples to just actually say that, I think we are witnessing a moral panic around drill music. I think that there is it's very easy sometimes to look back at the 50s, 60s and see, all these kind of mad, uptight people worrying about Elvis's hips, turning a new generation into degenerate sex fiends or something like that, and not realise that we're going through something similar today. And I think it is really very frightening when you read some of the things that some of the proposals made by the Metropolitan Police, for instance. So some of the things that are happening are police are calling on YouTube to remove drill videos. YouTube have complied with about half of that. Thankfully, some enterprising soul has uploaded them to Pornhub so that we can still watch them. There is a court order, the first of its kind, against the group 1011. It's part of a CBO, which is the kind of spiritual successor to the ASBO, which means that now they have to ask the police's permission if they want to release any music or film a new music video. And really most frightening was, I think, the deputy commander, a guy called Jim Stokely, and he said that drill music and drill videos should be treated as if they are terrorist propaganda. And that violent lyrics and violent imagery should not have to be shown responsible for any specific crime in order for it to be criminal. Now, let's just think about that for a minute. Just violent lyrics are somehow free-floating in this atmosphere of violence, causing people to do violent acts. We have the Metropolitan Police, the people who are supposed to uphold the law in this country, who are unwilling to make any distinction between actions and words. And I think the reason, I sort of was joking a little bit about the kind of middle-class embrace of grime, but I think it is relevant in this case. This really is music. This is words, this is videos, it's an aesthetic, it's something that's different, it's something that's a bit scary. They don't espouse the correct values, they don't say the right things, but what do we expect? That's exciting for lots of teenagers. That's something that lots of teenagers will want to get into. It's clearly something quite countercultural in a way. And, whether I'm kind of not interested so much in this question of whether it can be rehabilitated, whether the genre is going to succeed or not. But the point is that it needs space to breathe if it's going to go anywhere. It cannot have the state breathing down its neck constantly. If it's going to evolve, if it's going to potentially push art forward, potentially it will go nowhere. Potentially it's rubbish. Those are all distinct possibilities in this case. And the thing about this is that there is a general, quite scary sort of consensus that there are different types ways that things get censored. There is the kind of law and order reason for censorship, which appears to be what's going on here. If we censor this music, we will uphold order. But today, increasingly, one of the problems is that censorship is now used to, in a sense, protect the vulnerable. It's to prevent vulnerable people from hearing the wrong thing. And I think that this is also at play. You know, this is also a problem in the context of drill, because in some ways these men, even though, or teenagers, even though they're wielding knives and wearing masks to, you know, partly to scare people, partly as a part of the interesting, something that's a bit different in terms of cultural expression, and partly because some of them really are in gangs. The problem is that we see the music as having an outsized influence on what other people can do. We see it as if, you know, we think that other people are vulnerable to hearing this music and then acting, and that's a serious problem. But the fact is that hundreds of thousands of people watch these videos on YouTube and do not go on to commit acts of violence. I'm going to kind of leave it there, but my kind of main interest in this is that I really think that this is the front line of free speech and state censorship today, and it worries me enormously that we can't make this distinction between music or expression and action.
Okay, I said that this was going to be more of a kind of relative, reflective session rather than absolutes. And certainly, you've got three different perspectives on this genre. I do think that what Ciaran said in relation to the question of the power of this music and the outlet in terms of giving young people a voice who are marginalized in society is quite important. And whether you actually feel that that voice is one that is saying something positive or negative, I'd be interested to get your reaction to that. In terms of Patrick, I think the issue of rehabilitation and the question of a certain element of social responsibility on the part of an artist is still something that's quite important. There are aspects of drill music in terms of lyricism I find quite offensive and certainly don't feel in any way is progressive. And there are moments where I just want to switch it off. But is that in itself a problem? Is it something that actually is merely a regurgitation in terms of the reaction of an older generation to new forms that comes up time and time again? And then more fundamentally, the question of censorship. And the truth of the matter is, you know, if you're on the right side of that line culturally, you're going to get props. If you're not, then you're going to get slaughtered. And it seems to me something also that Ciaran said, talked about lazy journalism, the inability of people to really probe and understand where young people are coming from and what's going on in our society. But I think Fraser's notion of what he described as correct values, I think is quite a provocative idea. And certainly the question of censorship in the arts is something that's quite pronounced at this time. But again, counter to that, is there something to be said for actually trying to raise the level of the art form? Shouldn't we actually be advocates of that? Or is it simply a question of accepting that, well, young people, marginalized situations, they can't help but be vulgar, violent, sexist? Are those the standards that we anticipate that are going to propel society forward? So I'm going to leave it there. I want questions to the panelists first of all.
Sorry, short thesis, I'm afraid. Could I bring the panel on to the second part of the question, which is what is inciting violence on our streets? Because we do have a London-specific problem amongst a particular group of young men. And I think drill is just one of a number of pathetic explanations. And Fraser, I share everything you say about it being a moral panic, and I do remember exactly the same thing being said about grime. One thing I think about there is a really I do a lot of legal work with people who've been convicted of knife crime, young black men who've been convicted of these offences. And one thing I notice in the discussion around it is just how little we talk about them. And when we do talk about them, we talk about them as though they're aliens, or the more common phrase, gang members. And gang members has been the most dehumanising, awful word we could use, because it pretends that this is something far different to what it is. If you look at what's going on in these crimes, these are groups of young male friends falling out and often resolving that falling out through nihilistic acts of violence. And if we can't even bring ourselves to look those people in the eye as members of our community and say what is going on, we're going to really struggle. And I think it goes back to some of the points that were raised in the last session on race. We sell young black men so short when we fail to say what is happening here. And I think the drill, the idea that they're disenfranchised, I don't think young black men are particularly disenfranchised in London. And if they are feeling disenfranchised, it's because we continually tell them that they're disenfranchised and that they have no other option other than to form these groups. It's not good enough. And so can I just get the panel's thoughts on how we address that problem and stop talking about and move on from the idea that this has anything to do with drill music?
I'm kind of coming at this from a bit of an outsider's perspective because I don't really know a great deal about drill, but from the comments that are made, it sounds as if effectively it's a genre that glorifies, violence and problematic behaviour. It seems a little bit, patronising and also a bit problematic to say that, people who engage in this kind of music come from a background, this is their way of responding to it. I'd have thought we would want to treat them more as we would treat anyone else in society that promotes these dangerous ideas and engage with them and criticise them. And say, to the extent that they're coming from a difficult background, they should be encouraged not to glorify the worst aspects of that, but to engage and criticise.
Yeah, I don't know, everyone seems to be talking about offence of late, and I'm someone who, I think you should be able to offend, and so the notion of drill to me seems like it's almost like a good thing because it's a representative of the people of their society where they grew up. However, there's an endemic irony in it that certainly with this music, when it's so offensive, where there's misogynistic ideas, where there's ideas of homophobia, where there's ideas of rape, and they're so prolifically sang about or rapped about that in a positive light, then that's somewhat ironic to our kind of notion of what everyone's going on about. Basically, I think that's the way it kind of comes across, and so I think that's just an irony that maybe some of you want to address.
I accept the arguments that drill music is an art form and it's a form of music that gives pleasure, and like many previous types of music, it's maybe it's not appreciated in the current moment, and it might be in future years. And that the state shouldn't ban it. However, I also recognise that it's a recruitment tool, and it is part of an ecosystem of gang violence and recruitment in London. And that is a challenge that I'm surprised that very few people in the black community or community leaders are willing to talk about, when they're very keen to talk about other kinds of offensiveness, other kinds of stereotyping of young black boys in the BBC and in the news and by the police. And yet this art form, which represents blackness and black culture in a very degraded way, in a way which does not fully represent black culture in my view, certainly not lots of black people that I know, they don't go around killing each other and stabbing each other. It's interesting that there is so little discussion about what is this cultural art form, what does it mean? And I do think, to follow the point that was made down there earlier, there is a reluctance really to talk about gang crime and gang violence. And in a way, it's interesting that the establishment has embraced drill almost as a kind of, I would say, patronising way of saying that we're inclusive. We want to welcome these people, these black people, because of their art form. When really what they're doing is they're patronising a black community. I think that I don't have a judgment on whether it's a good art form or not. I entirely believe that it's a valid musical form, but I also recognise that there is another dimension here, and it's just an interesting thing that so few people want to talk about it amongst those activists and so-called black community leaders. And why is that?
So I'm just going to put out a provocation of my own, which is that if the question of drill music is secondary to the question of what's actually happening to what I would describe as the black working class generally, and and the question of marginalisation isn't really a feature. We have Sean Bailey, who's going to be running for the London Mayor, who's very clearly targeting drill music as being, in essence, a part of the problem of what is actually happening in our urban centres. So, you know, is there something there? Is it that those people, in fact, running a kind of fairly orthodox anti-censorship argument are missing some of the complexity in terms of the relationship between this music and what it signals between the relationships between not just, I suppose, gang members, but communities made up of individuals who are actually in different situations to perhaps previous generations? Let's kick it off. So, Ciaran?
Yeah, thank you for your comments and questions. So I think the question of like why is youth violence soaring? It is, you know, if I'm saying that it's not drill music that's to blame, then I think that it's only right that you kind of ask why, what alternative things that should be blamed. I don't think that there is, I mean, as is obvious, there isn't just one answer to why youth violence is soaring at the moment. I kind of alluded to a lot of the pressures that are occurring in a lot of communities in London, I think in a unique way. Earlier when I talked about all the different kind of trends that I think that we could be discussing whilst trying to unpick the problem of youth violence. And I think there is actually progress now discursively being made in terms of, and I suppose at policy level therefore, because there's this idea of seeing youth violence as a public health problem, and that is now like formally recognised in London policy as of the last few months this summer. There's been great work that's been done by the Youth Violence Commission and the All-Party Parliamentary Group on knife violence that has like pushed the issue into the forefront and then taken ideas from both America and in Glasgow to then try and tackle this as a problem, frame it as a problem of public health, and then tackle it like that too. And that means having harsh punishments, but having even more emphasis on engagement and trying to nip problems in the bud at their very root, rather than trying to kind of like settle for just punishing or just trying to blame issues such as drill music that arises from it. So I suppose in a general sense, I think that there is this crisis of fear that really is spilling out. My assessment of it is there's this crisis of fear that's spilling out in particular communities around London that kind of reinforces itself, and it almost spreads like a disease where it becomes so normalised in people's lives that it just spreads and spreads and spreads, and it kind of gets into a cycle. And I think treating it as trying to really cut to the root in terms of education, but also in terms of just how you deal with someone that has just entered a hospital having been stabbed. You know, how do you treat that young person? Do you punish them, or do you treat them with the right compassion and understand the structural problems that have led them to that situation? So I think, as a general point, I think that there's a kind of a public health failure on this, and I think the recognition of that and the public health approach towards that is probably quite a positive thing this summer. I realise that kind of takes it away from the issue of drill music. And on that, I think, yeah, the point that was made about the engaging and not just getting rid of. For me, I see drill, as I've described it in my writing, as a cry for help. I realise that cry for help has unwanted other effects in terms of provoking and increasing the propensity for anger in particular young people that might listen to it and then be kind of pushed into a different mindset or tempted into a certain lifestyle. I suppose for me, I grew up obsessed with grime music. You know, I was fanatical about hip hop and grime. It was my life. Like all day, every day, I was listening to music, consuming music. But I was a middle class kid attending a grammar school in the suburbs. I was nowhere near where this music was being made, and I was so for me it was escapism. It was like just learning about another part of London. And for me, a lot of the boys I work with, when they're listening to drill, if you can describe drill as a kind of next generation's version of black music in London, a lot of them don't have the privilege that I had of being completely separate from the music. A lot of the content is happening around them, and so they're not able to listen to the music and then disassociate from it. They listen to the music, and it reinforces the reality that they and their older brothers or old uncles or whatever are experiencing. So I feel like engaging with that problem and engaging with the reality that drill music has kind of brought to the fore is a way more useful way of engaging with this, of like dealing with this as a problem than simply brushing it under the carpet. And I think brushing it under the carpet will actually kind of mean that it comes up in a much, if it can be even any more dark way in the future.
I'd like to respond to one thing that somebody said. You said, do people stab because they're told they are disenfranchised? I mean, I don't know whether you were being kind of slightly flippant when you said that, but I mean, clearly they don't. I mean, to answer that, I don't believe that anyone stabs because of a kind of a sort of feedback loop or sort of message that they're getting from the cultural left or whatever it is. I think in your formation, you've got to be a lot more developed in a particular way to actually make that move and commit that act. But at the same time, I take the point, which is that the kinds of, as it were, therapeutic voices in response to the problems that we're talking about here are inadequate to the problem and in many ways miss both the real source and offer inadequate solutions. I think that what I've seen as a problem in terms of how young people are expressing themselves and their situation, I don't think that we can make a kind of easy and simplistic assumption about the expressing voice in terms of kind of its authenticity. I think that that is a bit unwarranted to just assume that if one says something, it is a kind of direct reflection of something kind of real or whatever. There's all sorts of fantasy involved, there's all sorts of projection, there's longing, there's projective identification with all kinds of things. So we need to be kind of careful and sophisticated in that sense in how we respond. But I think that in general, there's a problem with how we deal with young people in terms of being adults and how we assert our adult authority and transmit our, as it were, understanding and wisdom and educate and uplift our young people. And for too long, going completely with the grain of expression and wanting to rehabilitate it, to find what is good in it, has been to instrumentalize it, to use it as a way of, in some ways, pacifying young people. It's kind of part of a consumer imperative that, this is what you're into, so we'll just give you more of this, okay? This is what your identity is, so because we don't have any ideas of our own and we're not seized with any kind of abiding vision of the good life and something better, we'll just give you something that's relevant and more.
Okay.
But just to basically round off, I think that so in other words, what I'm saying is that on the one hand, I don't think this is just all about the realm of ideas and kind of constructs in that sense with the young people, but I do think that certain narratives and messages are part of a broader degradation of how we actually work as adults with young people.
Okay.
Yeah, I kind of just wanted to pick up on that thing about adult authority. I think that is in some ways key to this. I think society is very fragmented. I find it very funny that gangs are seen as the problem. A few people getting together, committing petty crime usually, when really it's the lack of social solidarity and fragmentation. And the problem is that, as you say, there isn't something bigger that the adult world is offering to young black kids. I mean, you see a similar phenomenon in, the number of young people who join ISIS. 500 young people have decided that it seems more worthwhile to go to Syria and chop people's heads off than spend time in liberal Britain, which is really, really shocking. And there is a certain nihilism in youth culture that's reflected in the lyrics of drill, and I think that we can certainly draw that out. And in a lot of the time, there is a reluctance to talk about youth violence. I agree with you, Munir, on that, certainly. And there is a tendency to make excuses for it, whether those excuses are racism, cuts to youth centres, cuts to the police. I think the public health approach is part of that evasion of apportioning responsibility. Knife crime is absolutely not a disease, and it's a really excellent example of what you were saying. We really do sell young people, particularly young black men, short by saying that they are somehow different to us. They don't have responsibility for their actions. I don't know what's inciting violence, but I know what's not correcting these tendencies when they first appear. Why are people not? Why are these flashes of nihilism not being checked by responsible adults? That's, I think, is more the issue. I just wanted to come back to bring it sort of back about drill to sort of Kunle's provocation. Shouldn't we ask for more? Shouldn't we ask for something better, something less nihilistic, less misogynistic, or whatever? And yeah, fine. That might well be the work of critics and journalists and people within the music industry themselves to take responsibility for. That's fine, but art need not have a social purpose, and I worry that if anything, we're asking too much of art as it is, let alone drill music. We expect it to communicate the correct messages, to instill the right values in people, when really it's not very good at doing that, and it makes it not very interesting if it does that. Nobody wants to listen to a hip-hop song about getting up on time and going to school. I mean, it's of no interest to anyone. So anyway, I'll leave that there.
Yeah, okay. But following on from that, I would say the threat of legislation or some legal recourse is there. And we've already got, in the notes, it's mentioned that the Metropolitan Police claim that these videos actually are provoking the violence. So it's not a question of something that's abstract. This is actually real. And we have a discussion about whether or not an art form, whatever you think of it, should be banned, because it is linked to the moment of violence perpetrated in these instances.
So I'm a fan of the drill sound personally. I've been following since the Chicago days, 2012-ish. I listen to a lot of the YouTube stuff today. And just because I like transgressive art in general, similar to how you said about grime, I can't relate to it because I'm not from the same kind of area, so it is a kind of escapism in a way. I'm also a free speech absolutist, and that includes incitement to violence in the abstract, not necessarily targeted towards individuals. But that brings me to my question, which is, there are certain drill songs that I've heard where they will literally refer to a specific person from another gang who's either been killed, or like for example, there's a song called Take That Risk by CB, and I think the last lyric in that song is mocking another gang member that was shot and then also threatening his brother. And as far as I know in this country, if I was to threaten somebody in this room, that's considered a form of common assault. So while I'm a free speech absolutist, I'm wondering if there's a line to draw when you're literally threatening specific people within a song.
Hi there. I'd just like to ask the panel, but perhaps Ciaran specifically, when you ask these young drill fans why they like drill music, how do they answer?
I think there's something really dangerous in the idea that both the video made me do it and the lack of youth centres made me do it, which I hear all the flipping time. London riots happen, there's no youth centres. You think, since when did that cause a riot? And also the idea that somehow it's a health problem, I think, is extremely dangerous, and it removes moral responsibility for what people actually do. And so the idea that it's not a choice to stab somebody is such a dangerous idea, and people did say this earlier, you know, at the end of the day it's an act that you choose to do, and somehow removing that element of choice from that young person's behaviour is the most dangerous thing you can possibly do. And I agree with what Luke said about looking people in the eye, and I think for far too long adults in whichever sort of strata of society have really shied away from looking young people in the eye and saying, what the hell do you think you're doing, and what the hell do you think you're thinking? And have actually said, oh, we can't understand it because this is black culture, we can't understand it because it's these young boys, or, you know, we don't understand anything. And actually, you know, if there was a bit more probing that went on, and actually maybe in some ways breaking down the false solidarities of the black community that are built up through the kind of community leaders of the past, which I think are hiding a lot of this stuff. Speak to some of the mothers, and I really doubt that they just look at the videos and say, oh, well, you know, it's just my boy expressing himself. I really, really doubt that, and I totally don't think that censorship is the solution, because I think it reinforces the idea that the video made me do it. At the same time, it clearly, there's something going on here, and that in some ways is a positive reaction, I suspect, the do-gooding of the hip-hop community, which is another puke-making word, you know, there's positivity, this is really great, you know, which I hear all the time, and I can see why young people would react against that. But at the same time, when they react, or even prior to their reaction, we also need to have something to say, which is very different to just, well, I can really understand why you might say that. It's dangerous.
I just want to bring it back to, I think it was really interesting what Ciaran said about that inability to distance yourself. And just kind of as a quick response, it's really important to acknowledge that inability to distance oneself from that environment. This is not something just, you know, that's just portrayed in a song, but this is something that you see as soon as you step outside of your house. Like, yes, we acknowledge that choice to stab someone still exists, but to simply disregard the social context in which these people find themselves is simply foolish and simply just too simplistic. And I feel like when, you know, by saying that we shouldn't say that they don't have a choice is, again, simplistic, because these people are still going to be taken to prison when they stab that person, because clearly you can't stand up in a court and say, you know, no, they found themselves in that poor environment. But what's important is actually acknowledging the issues that underpin this crime, underpin the things that we find in this music, in this art form, and because by simply kind of shutting them off, by simply locking up these people, and by simply saying that you chose to stab that person regardless of where you come from, simply means that you're enforcing that us versus them mentality. You're enforcing the idea that you should be disillusioned with the system, and instead of actually realizing your potential and making them aware of the potential and the change that they can make in society.
I have two questions. One is really fast, and maybe for the sociology professor. Are there any randomized controlled trials or any formal study to analyze the relation between listening to music and the effects they could have in people? The other one has to do a little bit with my experience. I think what it's more dangerous about it is not that by listening to 12 hours of music you are gonna stab someone, but I've lived this in Mexico. You have a sense of normalization of violence. I've seen machine guns directly, and I am not afraid of that. I've seen dead people, and I don't feel anything now. And it's because you are bombarded constantly with, there are 20 people without head now, and the next day you have other 20 people are born alive. So once in a while you keep listening to this and you don't feel anything. You still feel that it's wrong, but you internalize it. Maybe by listening to this kind of music you can get that effect too. So it kind of worries me. I want to know what you think about this effect.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important point, the question of the normalization of violence and how it actually impacts on people. is something that we haven't really probed and probably won't have time to, but I think it's something that I think I'd be interested in the panel's thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just go straight to that question. I think that it's really important to draw a distinction between normalization of violence in real life, as you've described just there, and what might well be the case for, you know, young people in inner cities or whatever, and the violence in media and violence in, you know, popular culture. I mean, you can play all the violent video games you like or listen to all the violent music you like, but, you know, actually witnessing or participating in a violent act is such a very different thing, and I think we all know that instinctively. I don't think it's very difficult to confuse the two things. But perhaps if there is that background of it in real life, maybe that's the case. I wanted to pick up on the incitement to violence question, because actually this particular issue of drill is, I think, what has really clarified my thinking on this, because there is a kind of, you know, line you sort of sometimes might trot out in defending free speech. But I'm in free speech, but I'm against the incitement of violence, and I think this really clarifies the fact that I don't think there is such a thing as incitement to violence. I don't think that anyone else can be held responsible for you committing a violent act, and a lot of the time in the context of drill in particular, it's being talked about, you know, say for instance a gang member threatening someone and then that person responding to that threat. It seems to be a particularly weak example of that. You know, it's actually not even someone telling you to kill someone. It's someone, what's the word I'm looking for? Provoking you. And, you know, you can't allow, there's no, you cannot avoid responsibility that if someone provokes you into doing something through words, that it somehow isn't your fault. I kind of, there's one other question I wanted to come back on, and now I've forgotten what it is, so I'm just going to leave it there.
Another time. Simple.
Yeah, okay, so question about research. I think there's been various studies that have looked at things like music videos and on, you know, gaming, PlayStation type stuff, video games, experimental trials, etc., and to the best of my knowledge, they're largely inconclusive, and the sort of connection or correlation is at best somewhat tenuous, which isn't to say that they don't have effects and impacts, which could be of all sorts of things, and like anything else, you know, if you're sitting around watching drill videos all day long, you know, and you're not really doing much else, then there's kind of obviously lots of questions about the sort of life that you're living and, you know, other things that are going on in your situation. So, you know, you'd never want to fall into the trap of a sort of single kind of causal explanation in any event for why you see things the way that you see things, and etc. So in a sense, that kind of stuff is a red herring, I would argue. But your other point about brutalization and normalization, I think, is very important. But again, that's an empirical question in terms of the young people that we're thinking about here and the extent to whether the makers and producers of this stuff are or are not in a kind of high level involved in this stuff and doing this stuff, and the extent to which therefore they are brutalized and are embodying and enacting that brutalization in their work as rappers. So again, that's an empirical question, right? But the final question I'd like to speak to is this one about moral agency and choice, as against social determinants and social context and causality. So I think, you know, very well articulated were two contrasting positions on the question of the moral agent. And I would take a kind of midway position, which is that, yes, people absolutely do have choice. They must be responsible for the choices that they make, but choice is always constrained and enabled. Choice is always indexed in some way to a real world and a context. So again, it becomes an empirical question as to the situation of the individual, which is not a way of, smuggling into that, sort of excuses and blaming circumstances and whatnot. But it is to say that you can't just abstract these things. They are not just simple matters of good and evil.
Okay. Ciaran.
Thanks. When lyrics literally refer to specific people, I think that for me, there are a couple areas for me where this becomes even more messy and much more morally problematic. And I don't think that I have a really fine-tuned answer to it yet. It's really complex, but I think there are examples. If you can prove absolutely that this word and phrase was intended as a threat towards a specific individual, which I think is very difficult to prove given how cryptic drill lyrics often are, aside from the fact of whether it actually led to anything that wouldn't have happened anyway without the existence of that song, I think you're veering into, 1011, the group that were banned, famously talked about someone that was killed in a rival group. That's the kind of most quoted example of that, right? And that person's family kind of campaigned for that video to be taken down, and it wasn't taken down for a long time, and that became controversial. I'm not going to sit here and say that family shouldn't have a problem with their deceased son being talked about like that in a song. That's just obviously horrible and something that I think it should be interrogated. I don't know about the idea of censoring a whole genre based on these very specific examples. I suppose that would be the response to that. Why do the boys I work with like drill music? Generally, it's a reflection of my world. That's 99% of the time the sort of line they take. It's, this is my life, sir. This is my, if I was in school, this is what we see all around us. I'm not hearing anyone else talk honestly about the problems that our community faces, et cetera, et cetera. So it's though obviously not necessarily articulated like that, but it's usually an issue that I listen to drill because it tells me that my reality is real and to be taken seriously. That for me is my interpretation of why a lot of boys listen to it. And I guess to some extent that's why I listen to it a lot of the time, and I think it resonates a lot with my reality as a youth worker. If I'm spending a lot of my week talking to a certain people who have a certain perspective and experience, then I find it interesting to listen to the music that resonates with the experience of myself as a youth worker. So I can empathise with it on some level. I'm not saying that I'm a proponent for its content, but third thing, I just want to clarify because sorry. I'm not by any means advocating the public health approach and therefore being individual responsibility is in the bin. I'm saying some sort of combination of those two things. If you see me as a youth worker in action, I'm extremely strict. I hold boys responsible for stuff they do. I practice that absolutely, that people should be held responsible for what they do. I've worked in prisons. I've seen the consequences of people's actions. But I just mean to say that it should really, the context in which they live should really be taken seriously and the different forces at play. At no point did I say that youth clubs was the only issue, and I don't think anyone says that. I think that's one of hundreds, but it is a big one.
Okay. Thank you, panel. Can we give them a round of applause?